forest spirits. The morning fog lingered in the dense forest, shrouding the landscape in an eerie veil. A group of eager tourists, their faces bright with anticipation, gathered at the trailhead for a guided nature tour. The guide, an experienced ranger with a weathered face, welcomed them with a nod. He had led many tours through these woods, each with its own unique charm, but this time, something felt different. The forest was alive with the sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves as the group set out along the winding path. The air was cool and fresh, a welcome change from the stifling city heat. The guide explained the history of the forest, recounting tales of its ancient trees and hidden wildlife. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the towering canopy began to block out the sunlight, casting the trail into a dim, green twilight. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches twisting into strange shapes that danced in the shifting shadows. The tourists chatted and laughed, their voices echoing through the forest, oblivious to the subtle shift in the atmosphere. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As the group reached a clearing, the guide pointed out a large, ancient oak tree. Its trunk was thick and twisted, covered in moss and lichen. The guide spoke of its age and the legends associated with it, but the words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with an unspoken sense of foreboding. It was then that the first strange occurrence happened. One of the tourists, a young woman with bright eyes, noticed something moving among the underbrush. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but as she squinted, she saw a shadowy figure dart between the trees. She called out to her companions, but when they turned, the figure had vanished. A murmur of unease rippled through the group, but the guide reassured them with a calm demeanor. He explained that the forest was home to many creatures, some of which were elusive and rarely seen. He dismissed the incident as a fleeting glimpse of a deer or perhaps a fox. The group continued on, but the sense of unease lingered. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to change. The path became less defined, and the trees appeared to lean in closer, their branches forming an almost impenetrable barrier. The once comforting sounds of the forest now seemed distorted, as if the forest itself was whispering secrets just out of reach. As they moved through the thickening undergrowth, strange occurrences became more frequent. One tourist saw a fleeting glimmer of light between the trees, like a distant lantern, but when she approached, there was nothing there. Another felt a sudden chill, as if a cold breath had passed over her, though the air was still and warm. The guide's previously reassuring presence now seemed a little uncertain. His eyes scanned the surroundings more frequently, and his explanations became less detailed, more hurried. He had led many tours through these woods, but today he felt an unsettling change in the atmosphere, a shift that he couldn't quite explain. The group reached a small, isolated stream, its waters crystal clear and reflecting the dim green light filtering through the trees. They paused to rest and take in the serene beauty of the spot. The guide took the opportunity to tell a story about the forest's legends, a tale of ancient spirits said to inhabit the woods. As he spoke, the air grew colder, and the previously serene environment seemed to become more oppressive. The shadows among the trees appeared to deepen, and the forest's sounds became muffled, as if the woods themselves were listening. The tourists exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier excitement replaced by a growing sense of discomfort. Without warning, a sudden rustling sound came from the underbrush, followed by a soft, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to drift through the trees. The group fell silent, their breaths caught in their throats as they strained to hear the source of the sound. The guide's face grew tense, his eyes darting nervously around the clearing. The first part of their journey had begun to reveal a side of the forest that was both unsettling and mysterious. The forest, once a place of adventure and beauty, now seemed to be hiding secrets, its ancient spirits watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. As the group resumed their trek along the stream, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The shadows seemed to thicken around them, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush felt more pronounced, as if the forest was teeming with unseen eyes. The guide's attempts to maintain a reassuring tone fell flat as he noticed the growing unease among the tourists. The path, now less defined, wound through a labyrinth of undergrowth and tangled roots. The tourists clung to their guide's every word, seeking comfort in his familiarity with the terrain. But the guide's usual confidence was waning, replaced by a subtle anxiety that he struggled to hide. A sudden crackling sound made everyone freeze. It was as though something heavy had moved through the brush, and the rustling that followed was louder and more deliberate than before. The group glanced around, trying to pinpoint the source of the disturbance. A few brave souls peered into the shadows, their faces illuminated by the dim, filtered light. The guide attempted to explain the noise away as the movement of a larger animal, perhaps a bear or a moose. Yet his voice lacked conviction, and the tourists could sense his growing discomfort. The forest, once a backdrop to a pleasant hike, now seemed to be closing in on them, its dense foliage creating an oppressive sense of confinement. As they continued, the trees became increasingly twisted and gnarled, their branches forming grotesque shapes that seemed to reach out towards the path. The air grew cooler, and the whispers of the forest grew louder, though no discernible words could be made out. The guide's stories about the forest's history took on a darker tone, his voice low and strained. One of the tourists, a middle-aged man with a keen sense of observation, noticed something odd about the surrounding trees. Their bark seemed to have an unusual texture, almost as if it were covered in strange symbols or markings. He pointed this out to the group, but as they examined the trees more closely, the markings appeared to vanish, leaving only the normal, rough texture of the bark. A sense of dread settled over the group as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The once vibrant forest was now shrouded in twilight, the shadows elongating and merging into one another. The guide hastened their pace, eager to reach the end of the trail before darkness fully enveloped them. The stream they followed grew narrower, its water becoming darker and more reflective, almost like a mirror. The tourists, their nerves frayed, walked in silence, each person absorbed in their own thoughts. The guide's attempts at small talk were met with distracted nods and uneasy glances. As they entered a particularly dense part of the forest, the temperature dropped noticeably. The guide called for a brief rest, hoping to calm the group and regain his own composure. The tourists huddled together, trying to ignore the growing chill that seemed to seep into their bones. A sudden, high-pitched scream shattered the uneasy quiet. The tourists turned to see a young woman standing frozen, her eyes wide with terror. She pointed toward a cluster of trees where a shadowy figure had darted between the trunks. The figure was barely visible, a fleeting silhouette against the darkening forest. The guide, his face pale, tried to reassure the group, but his voice trembled as he spoke. He insisted that the shadow was likely a trick of the light or an animal moving through the trees. However, the sense of foreboding among the tourists had deepened, and their earlier excitement had transformed into a palpable fear. The group resumed their journey, the shadows of the forest growing longer and more menacing with each step. The once familiar path now seemed to twist and turn unpredictably, as if the forest itself was guiding them deeper into its heart. The whispers grew more insistent, weaving through the trees and wrapping around the tourists like an invisible shroud. As night fell, the forest became an impenetrable blackness, the moonlight struggling to penetrate the dense canopy above. The guide's flashlight flickered weakly, casting erratic beams of light that only served to heighten the sense of unease. The tourists huddled closer together, their fear growing with each step they took. The forest, now silent except for the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. The group's sense of dread was nearly unbearable, and the guide's attempts to maintain a semblance of normalcy only seemed to heighten their anxiety. The journey through the forest had transformed from a pleasant excursion into a nightmarish ordeal, with the shadows and whispers closing in around them, and the forest's ancient spirits waiting for their moment to reveal themselves. The night deepened, and the forest grew even darker, the canopy above blocking out most of the moonlight. The tourists stumbled along the uneven trail, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves and moss. The guide's flashlight struggled against the darkness, casting eerie, flickering shadows that danced among the trees. The chilling wind rustled through the branches, carrying with it an unsettling whisper that seemed to come from all directions. The tourists clutched their jackets tighter, trying to shield themselves from the biting cold and the growing sense of unease. The once calm stream beside them had become a dark, foreboding ribbon, its waters reflecting the shadows rather than the sky. Every now and then, one of the tourists would catch a glimpse of something moving between the trees, an elusive shape or a fleeting glimmer of light. Each sighting was accompanied by a collective gasp, followed by nervous laughter that did little to mask their fear. The guide, though determined to maintain his composure, appeared increasingly agitated, his eyes darting nervously through the darkness. They reached a small, abandoned cabin nestled among the trees. Its wooden walls were covered in moss and creeping ivy, and the windows were dark and uninviting. The guide stopped here, hoping to offer a brief respite. He suggested that they take a few moments to rest and gather their nerves. The cabin, though dilapidated, provided some shelter from the wind, and the group eagerly took advantage of it. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit by the weak beam of the guide's flashlight. Dust hung in the air, and the wooden floorboards creaked under their weight. The tourists huddled together, their faces illuminated by the flickering light as they sat on the rotting furniture. The guide tried to lighten the mood with a story about the cabin's history, but his voice wavered, and the story fell flat against the oppressive atmosphere. As they rested, the whispering winds outside seemed to grow louder, their voices merging into an unintelligible murmur. One of the tourists, a young man with a camera, began taking photos of the interior, hoping to capture the eerie ambiance of the cabin. The camera's flash illuminated the room in brief bursts, revealing the cobwebs and decay that had taken over the space. It was then that they heard a new sound of faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the walls. The sound was irregular, like something scratching or tapping from the outside. The tourists exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier nervousness turning into outright fear. The guide, his face pale, tried to reassure them once again, attributing the noise to the settling of the old cabin or the wind interacting with the structure. The tapping continued, growing louder and more persistent. It seemed to move around the cabin, shifting from one wall to another. The guide's flashlight flickered erratically, casting unsettling shadows that seemed to move on their own. The tourists' fear escalated as the tapping grew louder, a relentless, rhythmic noise that seemed to pulse with a sinister intent. Unable to tolerate the noise any longer, the guide led the group outside. The night air was even colder, and the darkness seemed to press in on them from all sides. The forest was eerily silent now, the earlier whispers replaced by an oppressive stillness. The tourists huddled together, their breath visible in the cold air, their fear palpable. As they resumed their trek, the forest felt different. The trees seemed to close in around them, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes that loomed over the path. The shadows appeared to shift and move, as if they were alive. The guide's flashlight revealed glimpses of strange markings on the tree's symbols that looked like they had been carved into the bark with great effort. One of the tourists, a woman with a keen interest in folklore, began to recognize some of the symbols from old legends about forest spirits and ancient rites. Her recognition only added to the growing sense of dread among the group. The guide, sensing the rising panic, tried to push forward, urging them to keep moving. The path, now more overgrown and treacherous, seemed to twist and turn unpredictably. The forest appeared to be playing tricks on them, its shadows and whispers creating a disorienting maze. The tourists, their nerves frayed, struggled to keep their footing as they stumbled over roots and rocks. The sense of foreboding grew stronger with every step, and the guide's attempts to maintain a semblance of normalcy were becoming increasingly futile. The forest, once a place of adventure and wonder, had turned into a nightmarish labyrinth, with the shadows and whispers closing in tighter around them. The group's fear was palpable, their earlier excitement replaced by a profound sense of dread as they ventured deeper into the heart of the forest, where the ancient spirits waited. The journey through the forest grew increasingly surreal as the night wore on. The once familiar path had completely vanished, replaced by a tangled mess of underbrush and twisted trees. The tourists struggled to keep their bearings, their flashlight beams cutting through the oppressive darkness, but revealing little beyond the immediate area. The guide's attempts to navigate were met with growing frustration. He consulted his map and GPS, but both devices seemed unreliable in the depths of the forest. The trees loomed closer, their branches creating an almost impenetrable wall of darkness. The air was heavy, with an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the distant hoot of an owl. As they stumbled through the forest, the guide's demeanor became increasingly desperate. He encouraged the group to keep moving, insisting that they were nearing a safe area, but his voice lacked conviction. The tourists, their anxiety escalating, clung to each other for comfort, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. The forest's oppressive atmosphere seemed to close in on them. Strange, unidentifiable shapes moved in the periphery of their vision, vanishing whenever they turned their heads. The whispers that had been a faint background murmur were now louder, more insistent, and seemed to echo from every direction. The voices were incomprehensible, their tone both pleading and threatening. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, carrying with it an eerie, mournful wail. The sound seemed to resonate through the forest, filling the tourists with an inexplicable sense of dread. They huddled closer together, their fear palpable, as they strained to understand the source of the sound. The guide's flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic patterns of light and shadow. The shadows appeared to take on strange forms, resembling ghostly figures that seemed to reach out from the darkness. The guide's face was taut with stress as he fought to maintain control of the situation. His voice was firm but betraying a hint of panic. The group stumbled upon a clearing, a rare open space in the dense forest. The clearing was eerily quiet, its emptiness starkly contrasting with the oppressive surroundings. In the center of the clearing stood a large, ancient stone altar, covered in moss and lichen. The guide hesitated before approaching the altar, his flashlight revealing strange carvings etched into its surface. The carvings were intricate and unfamiliar, depicting scenes of ancient rites and eerie figures that seemed to move when viewed from different angles. The guide's attempts to explain the carvings were met with uneasy silence. The tourists were too absorbed in their growing fear to listen, their eyes darting nervously around the clearing. As they gathered around the altar, a low rumbling sound began to emanate from beneath the ground. The sound grew louder, vibrating through the clearing and causing the tourists to look at each other in alarm. The guide's flashlight illuminated a series of cracks appearing on the ground around the altar, as if something was trying to break through from below. Panic set in as the ground trembled and the cracks widened. The tourists scrambled away from the altar, their fear driving them to seek safety. The guide tried to calm them, but his voice was drowned out by the growing intensity of the rumbling. The forest seemed to come alive, the trees shaking and the whispers rising to a frenzied crescendo. In the midst of the chaos, a figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the clearing. It was tall and thin, with an indistinct shape that seemed to shift and blur. The figure moved slowly, its presence radiating a palpable sense of menace. The tourists froze, their fear paralyzing them as they watched the figure approach. The guide's flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The only light came from the intermittent flashes of lightning in the distance, casting eerie, flickering shadows across the clearing. The figure drew closer, its form becoming more distinct with each step. The tourists, their terror mounting, huddled together, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The guide, now visibly trembling, tried to reassure them, but his words were swallowed by the darkness. The forest, once a place of exploration and adventure, had become a nightmarish realm where ancient spirits and dark forces held sway. The rumbling beneath the ground reached a climax, and the altar began to crack apart. The ground around it split open, revealing a yawning chasm that seemed to descend into an endless abyss. The figure at the edge of the clearing stood motionless, its gaze fixed on the altar and the darkness below. The tourists' fear reached its peak as they realized the gravity of their situation. The forest had turned against them, its ancient spirits awakening to claim those who had ventured too far into its depths. As the ground continued to tremble and the figure loomed closer, the group's desperate struggle for escape became a frantic race against the encroaching darkness. The chasm beneath the altar widened, revealing an inky darkness that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The tourists, their fear escalating to near hysteria, scrambled to find a way out of the clearing. The figure at the edge of the clearing remained eerily still, its gaze fixed on the gaping void as if drawn to it by some unseen force. The rumbling beneath them grew louder, shaking the ground with increasing intensity. The trees surrounding the clearing swayed violently, their branches lashing out as if trying to pull the tourists back into the forest. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom, and the whispers that had once been faint now roared with an almost deafening intensity. The guide, his face ashen with fear, attempted to lead the group away from the clearing, his flashlight flickering on and off, as if struggling against the dark forces surrounding them. The tourists followed, their steps hurried and disjointed as they navigated the treacherous terrain. The shadows seemed to chase them, closing in with each step they took. As they stumbled through the forest, the strange symbols carved into the trees became more frequent, their meanings lost in the oppressive darkness. The whispers in the wind grew louder, their voices merging into a cacophony of disembodied cries and mournful wails. The forest felt alive, its every sound and movement amplifying the sense of terror that gripped the group. A sudden burst of lightning illuminated the forest, revealing the twisted, gnarled figures that seemed to emerge from the shadows. The figures were indistinct and shifting, their forms barely recognizable as they moved among the trees. The tourists' screams were swallowed by the roar of the wind as they raced through the forest, their path lit only by the sporadic flashes of lightning. The guide led them towards what he hoped was an exit from the forest, his own fear pushing him forward despite his growing exhaustion. The forest seemed to fight against them, its branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and the ground beneath them was uneven, making each step a perilous endeavor. In their frantic flight, one of the tourists, a young woman with a keen sense of direction, spotted a faint glow in the distance. She pointed it out to the group, her voice trembling with hope. The guide, seizing on this glimmer of potential safety, urged the group to move towards it. As they approached the source of the light, the forest seemed to relent, the oppressive shadows lifting slightly, as if to allow their escape. The light grew brighter, revealing a small, dimly lit cabin similar to the one they had encountered earlier. The tourists hurried inside, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they closed the door behind them. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished but offered a welcome respite from the terror outside. The light, emanating from a solitary oil lamp on a table, cast a warm, flickering glow. The group huddled together, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. The guide, though still visibly shaken, attempted to calm them, assuring them that they were safe for the moment. As they caught their breath, the sounds of the forest outside seemed to recede. The whispers and the rumbling faded, leaving only the occasional creak of the cabin and the soft patter of rain on the roof. The tourists exchanged nervous glances, their relief tempered by the lingering fear of what they had just experienced. The guide, now more composed, explained that they had ventured into an area of the forest known for its ancient legends and mysterious occurrences. He spoke of old tales about forest spirits and curses, but his words did little to comfort the group. The terror of their ordeal was still fresh in their minds, and the forest's dark presence felt as if it was still watching them from just beyond the cabin walls. As the night wore on, the tourists remained in the cabin, their fear giving way to exhaustion. They huddled together, seeking solace in each other's presence. The guide stayed near the window, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the malevolent forces they had encountered. Dawn finally broke, casting a pale light over the forest. The tourists, still shaken but relieved, prepared to leave the cabin and return to safety. The guide led them back through the forest, the path now seemingly more familiar and less menacing. The forest, though still dense and shadowy, no longer held the same oppressive atmosphere. As they emerged from the forest, the tourists looked back at the dark, mysterious woods with a mix of fear and relief. The experience had left them with a deep sense of unease and a newfound respect for the ancient legends that had come to life. The forest spirits, once merely a myth, had revealed their true nature, and the group would never forget the terror they had faced in the heart of the forest.